What's shaking, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more Japan as we move toward the last few tunes on Obscure Alternatives, 1978. Big thank you to Phil once again. And the next track is The Tenant. And no, we're not talking Neil. I assume this is depicting a resident of a tenement building and thus someone who is renting, and in that regard, it could go anywhere, right? It could be anything. Ultimately, it is a starting point. I suppose there are some socioeconomic implications just in the simple phrase itself, but no indication of what shape that might take or the centrality or not of that characteristic. So let's give it a listen and I'll see what I can follow. This is Japan. The track is The Tenant, and it's from their 1978 album, Obscure Alternatives. What an incredible surprise that was, given the overall feeling of the last two albums. Now, to be fair, Obscure Alternatives hasn't been quite as raw and edgy as Adolescent Sex, but still, there's been a funk sound, and Sylvian's vocals have been different from what I know later. Admittedly, again, I think there's a progression and an evolution from the previous album to this one. But this feels more like the later Japan. This feels very artsy and like cinematic in its scope, and not just because it's instrumental, but there were sounds that were not arrhythmic entirely, but they felt more like bells or something, like world sounds rather than like in time as like parts of the track. And then of course the natural instrument feel of a lot of it. Now there is keyboard there, and there are some like synth sounds along the way, but generally speaking, the piano's doing the lead. There's an electric guitar which has these like long extended moments, and admittedly the electric guitar had a bit of edge to it, but overall it's like this sense of grace and atmosphere and like cinematic feel. And there are these, again, sort of like keyboard chords, like kind of pad chords toward the end that I was catching. And then I think that was a saxophone that came in eventually in the second half of the track. I'm not sure, because again, it didn't have the typical writing of like an 80s or I guess late 70s saxophone bit, but I think that was a saxophone. And that gave it a bit of a like nighttime urban feel. And indeed, the best I can make of the title is that like there was a bit of a like melancholy or bleakness to the track. Even as it had this melody and this cinematic richness, it felt like nighttime in an urban setting, a bit of rain outside, looking out at like neon signs or street lights, and just feeling like you're kind of caught in that world, because again, you're renting and you don't make a lot of money beyond that. Like, I felt like the plight of the tenant in some of the vibes of the tune. Now again, that's a completely speculative reading of a non-lyrical track, so yeah, that's just the way the tune hit me, and then what I felt about the title having gone through the track. It felt long. I want to say like 5.5, 6 minutes. Oh shit, in fact over 7, although now it feels like it didn't feel quite that long. Like it went by more quickly than I would think if I knew it was a 7-minute track. So yeah, again, it feels like that's more where they're going rather than where they are at this point, or certainly where they've been. So that's a really interesting one. I enjoyed that a lot. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Peace.